So sure, you have to be able to, write grammatical sentences and make smooth transitions. But a huge core part underlying all of it is being able to imagine what it's like to be your reader. What does that person care about? What do they not care about? What do they know and not know and need to know? Being able to think about those things makes you a better writer because you're an advocate for your reader and understanding where they're coming from.
Welcome to the Publishing Playbook, the podcast that goes behind the scenes of the book publishing world. Our goal is to help you understand publishing better, collaborate with the team behind your book, and find your readers. I'm your host, Sarah Russo, the founder and CEO of Page One Media and Page One Education. In this episode, I sit down with science writer Siri Carpenter. Siri is the executive director of The Open Notebook, a nonprofit she co-founded in 2010 to help science journalists learn from one another. We discuss Siri's path to self-publishing her first book, The Craft of Science Writing, and how she landed a deal with the University of Chicago Press for a second expanded edition. Siri also tells us about her latest project, The Best Science Stories and How They Work, which pairs fascinating articles with detailed annotations and features journalists like Mary Roach and Yong. We also dig into course adoption, book design, and why empathy for your reader is a non-negotiable writing skill. Siri, you've worn so many hats during the course of your career. You're a science writer, you're an editor, you're an educator, you are also the executive director of The Open Notebook. Will you tell me a little bit about all of these various roles and how they've led you to where you are now?
I started out in science. I was getting my PhD in social psychology when I realized that science writing was a job and that I wanted that job. And for a long time in my career, I was mostly freelance. I was writing for a variety of magazines and newspapers and websites and kind of learning on the job. I started having in my sights the idea of turning this little labor of love side project, The Open Notebook, into something bigger and something that could eventually be my job.
Can you tell us a little bit about The Open Notebook and the impetus for founding it and why it's so important, not only to you, but to science journalism and journalism more broadly?
As I was moving along in my freelance career, sometimes I just kind of felt lonely. I didn't feel like I had a real community of people around me who were doing what I did and who I could compare notes with and troubleshoot with and so on. But I got to be friends with a woman named Jeannie Erdman, who is a health and medical journalist based in Missouri. And a lot of times we found ourselves talking about stories that we had just read that we liked. And, we'd say, I wonder how that person got that idea for that story, or I wonder how they began to report it. And somewhere along the way, we had the idea of just kind of for our own edification to interview a bunch of science writers about specific stories that we had read and liked and admired. And then we were like, these are really interesting. Maybe some other people would think they're interesting too. Maybe we should put them up on the internet somewhere. But it was just really a little side project for us and not something that we ever intended to grow into a major nonprofit organization.
Yeah, what it is today. What was this? What year was this?
That was 2010. We just celebrated our 15th anniversary.
We first met when you were preparing to self-publish The Craft of Science Writing, which I have here for folks to see. This is the original one.
Baby.
There's now a second edition. I want to talk a little bit about that process. I had big reservations for you and self-publishing at the time, and ultimately it all worked out kind of brilliantly in the end. Can you explain to our listeners a little bit about why you chose to self-publish? Why was that the route you took?
Well, it was really the route that I took because I didn't see any other route. I wanted that book to exist, but these articles had already been published and were freely available at the Open Notebook. And so I wasn't able to interest an agent in even trying to sell a book like that to a traditional publisher. I think the major concern was that if these things are already freely available and published, why would anyone buy that book? And I remember kind of thinking, well, I'll just self-publish it. And that word just was incredibly naive, as I learned. I'm kind of glad that I didn't understand how much work it is to publish a book to professional standards, to self-publish a book to professional standards, and that at least half that work comes after the book itself is actually done. And that's where I met you when, I thought that most of my work was done, and now I simply need to get the word out. And I learned a whole lot about the finer points of publication process, the self-publication process, and the marketing process.
The work you do before a book publishes is also monumental, though. There's the interior design, there's the jacket design, which I'll say this jacket is beautiful. Like I love the design on the original, and there's so much detail on it, which I don't know if folks can see, but it's genuinely beautifully done. But we learned all of this portion together. There was a whole metadata piece that needed to happen that, we certainly do in-house on the book publishing end. Like we do that, but we have systems for that, right? That we have computer programs that all of that data goes into and feeds out to the retailers. You needed to figure out how to do that on your own. It can be really difficult to get a publisher to want to publish a book that is a collection of essays that have been previously published. And ultimately, you found a publisher for this book. The second edition came out almost 5 years later. Will you tell us a little bit about how you connected with the University of Chicago Press? Like what happened in between publishing and finding the publisher?
After the book was published, it was published, about 1 minute before the pandemic. It launched in February of 2020. So the whole plan of going on a little self-designed book tour just went down the tubes. I did some Zoom bookstore events that were, it was better than nothing, but kind of sad. And the book did sell. And we ended up selling over those first few years, over 3,000 copies of the book. The book was being assigned in journalism classrooms. And so it really felt like that paid off. I mean, I don't know if it paid off financially given the amount of work that it was, but it felt like it was a successful effort. And so I got connected through a colleague to an agent, Jillian McKenzie, who is wonderful. I initially approached her about the idea of doing a second book, a different book, but she felt like what we should try to do is try to sell a second edition of the first one through a traditional publisher and then take it from there. After doing a proposal and everything, we sold the book to the University of Chicago Press. And my editor there, Joe Calamia, is just absolutely wonderful and was very enthusiastic about the book. And then he actually is the one who suggested that we also do a different book, an additional book after that second edition of The Craft of Science Writing.
Yeah.
So we were just kind of off to the races at that point.
Yes, it's amazing. And we're going to talk about the second book in a little bit.
Sure.
But I just want to continue just for a minute on The Craft of Science Writing.
Sure.
When we were talking at this time, we really were talking quite a bit about libraries and journal-focused book reviews. Self-publishing is it's very, very hard to get attention in the traditional media environment for self-published books. So, but then we were talking about course adoption and the marketing tactics that you might utilize to get into those writing programs. How do you feel like that worked? Did one or the other move the needle a little bit better?
All of the major science writing programs, the book is assigned in at least one of the classes in those programs. So that includes MIT, NYU, UC Santa Cruz, and other programs. Yeah. One of the things that we did to sort of make the idea of assigning from the book easier for journalism instructors is that we created a page that's a sample syllabus that you could pull modules out of for like an introduction to science writing class, or you could pull modules out for other classes. And there are suggested readings and discussion questions and so on that all link back to chapters in the book.
That's so smart. That's like a really phenomenal idea. What you're experiencing is not unusual, right? Like not being able to determine exactly how one piece of marketing or publicity affects trajectory and sales. In-house, you might have a little bit of a better idea around the course adoption because they're doing very specific academic marketing outreach campaigns, and professors will ask for a desk copy, and that is usually an impetus for an order for the next next academic cycle. So there's ways to tease that out if your publisher is following it closely. As an individual who's publishing, it's a big challenge.
Yeah, and even with the second edition that that is published by the University of Chicago Press, and I think that they seem like they've done a really great job of intensively marketing the book for course adoption. I tend to learn that more incidentally, like if an instructor emails me first, and then I direct them to the publisher to take care of that.
You can ask that question. That's something.
Yeah,
that's
I should. It's like, it's on the list.
Of all in all your free time. I get it. I love your new book. It's called The Best Science Stories and How They Work. I love the interior design. It's so rare to see a book that has a different and interesting interior design. And in this book, you chose 11 science articles. You collaborate with some of the most famous science journalists working today. They're incredible. They're all people you know and you're reading. Each article is then annotated by another phenomenal science journalist. The contributors are people like Mary Roach and Ed Yong and Nadia Drake and Ashley Smart. Like, it's genuinely like, I'm fangirling about the science.
Me too.
And it's incredible. But my point is that the interior design of the book allows you to read the original article side by side with the annotations, which show you why this article is so effective. Was the layout an obvious stylistic choice?
Yeah.
Tell me about how that all worked a little bit.
It was a discussion with my editor Joe at U Chicago Press, and we did know early on that we thought that we would do it where the annotations were in the margins as opposed to interspersed within the text. But exactly what the layout would be, how wide would those margins be, how big would the book be, and so on. That was all on the designer, and I just got an advance copy or a bunch of advance copies last week. And last night I was just sitting in my hammock on the screen porch, reacquainting myself with this book because it's been many months since I turned in the final manuscript. And I just had so much fun and felt like, oh, this is a book that I want to sit in my hammock reading. I really hope other people do too.
I also really loved the pairings you created. So the first article in the book is by Sabrina Imbler.
Yeah.
And it's about how they learn to love centipedes. And it's funny, but it's incredibly informative. Can you talk a little bit about how you chose the pairing for that article?
The annotators for the articles needed to really be well matched to the stories and to the authors. And I felt like annotating this story, we need like the funniest person on earth. And so it was a no-brainer to ask Mary Roach if she would annotate that story. And she immediately said yes. And fun fact, she was also the very first annotator to turn around her annotation to me. So that was the very first one that I got to read. And it's just delightful and just as you would expect. For all of the different pieces, I really wanted people who resonate very deeply with each of the stories that they're annotating. So that one of the next story in the book is a very different piece by Ed Yong that's about long COVID and specifically about the fatigue that is part of long COVID or can be part of long COVID and just how incredibly devastating it can be. Ed won a Pulitzer Prize for his work covering COVID. And Amy Maxman is this brilliant journalist who I've known for many, many years and who herself has just done an incredible amount of work in covering health and medicine. I wanted the person annotating Ed's story to be someone who is really tuned in to the way that he relates to his sources. When I was looking for annotators, I was also looking for people who I just knew were really great journalists themselves, people who would have really astute observations, and people who I know are the kind of people who, like me, really enjoy deconstructing good journalism and figuring out what makes it tick. Not everyone is like that, but I wanted people who would have that sort of like reverse engineering kind of mindset about the journalism.
I feel like it's not a moment. I want to say it's a moment, but it's not. We've been in this progression for a decade or more around speed in journalism and how quickly journalists are expected to turn a story around. And I think COVID was a great example of that, because the information was new and different every day in the beginning. And then when you got to the science of long COVID, and that was also changing and shifting all the time, how does a science journalist deal with that? Well, I'm air quoting necessity of speed when the data and the facts are so vitally important, especially in a public health emergency like we were experiencing.
You know, the cliche is it's a marathon and not a sprint.
Yeah.
But people were really sprinting for a long time because people were reporting on emerging research in a way that many were just not accustomed to doing. The rates of journalists reporting on what are called preprints, which are scholarly articles that have not yet been peer-reviewed and published in a peer-reviewed journal, but instead are published or posted on what are called preprint servers. Journalists were having to draw a lot on that research because that was just the pace of the research that was happening, and they couldn't afford to wait 18 months or whatever it might be until a study would go through peer review. And it was really hard for a lot of journalists to avoid burnout. You know, I think a lot of people sacrificed their own health for the sake of their journalism. I mean, this all, of course, is intersecting with the journalism industry itself being in distress. So it's hard to tease apart those factors sometimes.
The tagline for the Open Notebook is "Every story is a science story." I agree. But can you explain your thinking around that and what that means to you and to the Open Notebook?
Yeah. That's our tagline because it's something that we ourselves came to understand over time. The vast majority of journalists don't have any particular training in science or in covering science or health or the environment. We just developed it as a mindset that we want our resources to be useful, not just to someone who maybe works for Scientific American or is writing for the New York Times science section or one of the science-focused publications, but also for a local weather reporter or the food editor at my local newspaper, or the traffic reporter, or an elections reporter, and so on. Funny story, this morning I was out for a walk with my dad, and I happened to be wearing one of our t-shirts that says "Every story is a science story." And there was a truck that pulled up alongside us, and he was stopped and waiting for his light. And he called out the window, total stranger, called out the window to me, "What's a science story today?" And it was like just completely out of the blue. And I just kind of laughed and I said, "Every story is a science story." Yeah. And he said, "Like what?" And I said, "Like traffic." You don't think of traffic reporting as being science reporting, and most stories that have to do with traffic or roads, transportation or whatever, you wouldn't label them science stories. But there's no topic, there's no beat that journalists cover that there aren't people who are doing research that is relevant to that beat, whether it's engineering or it's psychology or it's having to do with urban heat islands. Like there's so many different areas of research that are relevant to transportation and traffic, just as one example. When we say every story is a science story, we mean traffic and transportation and housing and agriculture and food and restaurants and crime and public safety. Every beat that journalists cover is one that we feel would benefit from scientific evidence and perspectives being more frequently incorporated into those stories.
Yeah. You've said it's important to have empathy for your audience as well. I think that is very true in all types of writing. And here we teach how to create an ideal reader avatar, which most people, if they do it at all, they do it after they've written the book. But I think it's also a helpful exercise before or during the writing process. Can you teach how to have empathy for your audience? If yes, like how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, empathy is just perspective taking, and I think half the battle is remembering to try to do it. When I teach workshops on writing and editing, I very often talk about empathy as one of the core skills that's needed. So sure, you have to be able to, write grammatical sentences and make smooth transitions. And, there's all kinds of technical skills involved in the writing, but a huge core part underlying all of it is being able to imagine what it's like to be your reader. And what does that person care about? What do they not care about? What do they know and not know and need to know? What do they not need to know in order to appreciate this story? What's going to bog them down too much? What's going to be confusing or boring? Being able to think about those things makes you a better writer because you're an advocate for your reader and understanding where they're coming from. But I do think that it's totally something that you can learn. It's not a magic trick, but it is just a habit of mind. I remember Ed Yong at some point, I think in an interview at the Open Notebook or somewhere else, he said he always just tries to remember no one has to read this. And so what are you doing that is making it most likely that they're going to want to read it or be able to understand it or be able to empathize with the characters you're building or be able to remember it and take action based on it, whatever your goals are with your story.
Science communication on social media and misinformation has exploded in the last 10 years. Do you feel like it's really important for science journalists to be on social media in order to communicate, I don't want to say real science, but like to combat disinformation and misinformation online? Is that something that we can even put on science journalists? Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it feels like combating misinformation is a Sisyphean task. Yes. The money that is behind the disinformation campaigns is so enormous compared with the money that goes into journalism that it can feel hopeless. I do think that that journalists still play a meaningful role in trying to combat misinformation. Partly, yes, through presence on social media, but in the stories themselves, by inoculating people, by inoculating readers to understand how to recognize likely disinformation or misinformation and how to understand core ideas around what science is and how science is done and who scientists are. The hope is that one of the roles that journalists can still play is in helping people develop the broader skills to be able to recognize it and question and be less likely to fall for it.
We always like to finish this conversation, Siri, by asking, what are you reading right now?
Yeah, I listened to some of your past episodes and I knew that you do that. And I'm not sure which to pick because I kind of uncharacteristically for me, I'm reading a bunch of different things right now.
You're not alone.
I usually try to keep it to like one print book and one audiobook at a time so that I don't have decision anxiety about what to pick up at any given moment. But it happens at the moment. I got a bunch of things going. I would say probably 90% of the books that I read, I listen to as audiobooks. Right now, I am listening to, this is a fun new twist on listening to audiobooks, which is that I like to swim and I got some bone conducting headphones that I can listen to underwater. And
I've never even heard of that. That's amazing.
Yeah, a friend of mine tuned me into these bone conducting headphones. I just finished about every 10 years or so, I revisit Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac.
Yes.
And I just finished listening to that. It was the first time that I've read that book underwater. It was really just a great meditative experience to be listening to it while swimming. And now a book that I'm listening to also underwater is called Why We Swim by a writer named Bonnie Swee. And it's a collection of essays about swimming, which is just perfect for listening to while swimming. It's kind of a mix of sociology and history and biology. And it's really, really fascinating. I don't even know how far through it I am because I'm just listening to it underwater till it ends. Yeah. But I'm probably half to 2/3 of the way through it and really enjoying that a lot. And then a book that I'm reading with my actual eyeballs is this book. It's called You Are Here, Poetry in the Natural World by a former poet laureate of the United States, Ada Limon.
You'll have to read The Sea Around Us by Rachel Carson while you're swimming.
Oh,
that would
yes,
be a great
that's a
swimming
great
book.
idea. Yes, yes, absolutely. That's a great idea.
Siri, this has been so wonderful. Thank you for joining us on the show today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Publishing Playbook. I'm your host, Sarah Russo. You can subscribe to our show wherever you like to get your podcasts, or find us on YouTube at Page One Media. This episode was produced by Julie Canfer with support from Bella Gibb and the team at New Books Network. For more information about Page One Media, please visit our website at www.pageonem.com. Keep on reading, and we'll talk to you soon.